Welcome to this afternoon's session of the Psychological Professions Conference. My name's Phil Self. I'm the co-chair of the Psychological Professions Network for the Southwest of England. And this workshop will be focusing on improving career pathways in the psychological professions. I hope that you've been able to catch some of the other sessions during the week and have been as inspired as I have by it, but it is Thursday afternoon. I suspect many of us have had extremely busy weeks already. So I hope you've got a cup of something sustaining or your favourite snack on hand, and you're ready for a workshop that I hope will not only be informative about work already going on, but will also engage you in shaping work that's yet to be done. Could we move on to the next slide? So this is just some of the housekeeping. Those of you that have managed to tune into previous sessions will already be familiar with some of this. We'd love to hear your comments and questions. Please do post in the Slido window, which should be on the right-hand side of your screens. During this session in particular, we really do want to hear feedback and thoughts as well as questions from you all the way through. So please do post within the Slido. If you experience any technical issues, please contact the email address that's on the screen now. And please note that the session is being recorded. So if you don't want your name to appear, please do post anonymously in the Slido. There's going to be some more information at the end of the session about where you can access the materials, how you can access the recording afterwards, and how you can download your attendance certificate as well. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So this is the outline for the session this afternoon. I'm going to set out some opening thoughts and introduce the whole session around improving career pathways. We've then also got some contributions from Rob Hardy from the National Workforce Development Centre, from Fiona Ballantyne-Dykes on behalf of the Scoped project in counselling and psychotherapy, from Geeta Bhutani, who's the co-chair of PPN England and the Northwest. And then we will come together at the end of the session and try and address some of the questions and comments that we've picked up from the Slido all the way through. There will be some questions that we'll be posing ourselves in the Slido later in the session as well. So please do really help us to scope the future of this by introducing that. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So if you have been able to join any of the other sessions this week, you probably will have noticed how frequently issues related to career pathways have already come up, both in the presentations and in questions and comments being posted through Slido. The topic that we're talking about this afternoon connects to several of the themes from the vision for the psychological professions. And it was the most common issue that was cited during a poll earlier in the week about what people wanted to see chief psychological professions officers across the country addressing. It also has obvious links with the session that we had this morning around quality of access to psychological professions. Yesterday afternoon, we had the session where we heard about 5 of the new roles that have emerged in order to meet specific workforce needs and support the expansion of the psychological professions in the NHS. We heard about the opportunities that these roles bring, the greater diversity of people being attracted into the roles compared with traditional ones, and the potential that these new roles have, not only to help address the overall workforce challenges across the NHS, but to help make all health and social care psychologically informed in the process. There's no doubt that these new roles are changing the NHS landscape, both in terms of increasing access to psychological expertise for the public, meeting service delivery aims, and providing new routes into careers as psychological professions. This is fertile ground for growth, with increased recognition of the need for psychological skill, supportive public policy, and a large pool of people interested in training and entry-level roles within psychological professions. However, it can feel a bit like multiple seeds are being scattered on this soil at the moment, all at the same time, potentially in a less than organised way. This flourishing of diversity might be a really good thing, allowing different varieties of psychological professions to take root in different local conditions and existing landscapes. But there's a question about how sustainable it might be. To quote one person who commented during the discussion yesterday, they said that we needed to move from short-term workforce fixes to sustainable careers. So there is a question, I think, about whether the talents of all these new recruits will be retained in the NHS over time, and whether people will be supported to develop sustained, fulfilling careers and become parts of the psychological canopy, or whether competition between roles and with more established roles as well might lead to a loss of talent over time and a potentially wasted opportunity that we have at the moment. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So while preparing for this, for this workshop, I should probably apologise to the number of people that I've pestered from different points in their careers and in different places around the country to get their perspectives and their individual perspectives on career pathways within psychological professions. Having spoken to a lot of different people in different places, I've tried to include some quotes from different groups on the next few slides. I'm not going to read out all of the quotes. Hopefully you'll be able to see some of those on the screen. But I would say that a theme across all of them was that there was a lot of excitement and hope about new roles, about increased opportunities and expansion when it comes to psychological professions. But when we started talking about career pathways, quite often the kind of the tone of the conversation turned a bit more towards confusion, frustration, and even anxiety, actually. And I just pick out, I think, from these quotes from different aspiring psychological professionals on the screen at the moment. Just from the first one, somebody who said to me that initially on realizing that psychological therapies was the path that I wanted to go down, it was a bit like being a kid in a sweet shop. There was so much choice. There must be an option that suits me and that's accessible. Wrong. What type of therapy to choose? What kind of training? Even now, 2 years later, from deciding this, I still feel overwhelmed. There was also quite a sense of anxiety, particularly amongst the aspiring psychological professionals, which I think connects with some of the themes that were picked up in the workshop this morning as well. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Although many of these new roles are different to traditional professions, in that they're emerging with a narrow scope of practice or within particular service contexts, the problem of coherent career pathways in psychological professions isn't a new one, or one that's exclusive to new roles and professions. Although we're increasingly coming together as a recognised family of professions within the NHS, we have different histories and traditions, having emerged in different places and at different times. Although we have huge areas of shared as well as unique competency as part of all our basic professional trainings, this isn't mapped onto a consistent framework that can support and recognise further professional development over a career. We haven't had equal access to CPD or to senior leadership roles within the NHS, and our separate career structures, registration and accreditation requirements, and training accreditation bodies have resulted in multiple barriers to development between psychological professions, effective glass ceilings, and apparent career dead ends. And from these quotes from different psychological professionals, I'd perhaps just pick out maybe the one on the top right hand side from a senior psychotherapist who said that there seems to be a ceiling for uni model psychotherapists in entering clinical leadership roles without operational management responsibility. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So this complexity and inequity is not only a problem for us as psychological professionals, but leads to confusion amongst managers and professionals from other groups, misunderstanding amongst the public and those accessing services, and can add to the disadvantage and anxiety faced by those aspiring to psychological careers, particularly those from diverse or disadvantaged backgrounds. And surely this limits the collective impact that we can potentially have on health and care services generally, as well as our ability to increase the diversity of our workforce. So just from this slide, maybe one that I'd pick out is the quote on the bottom left from somebody who has lived experience of using psychological services, who said different roles and professions in services can enhance approaches and provide choice, but it's confusing for many clients. The professional role of someone is not crucial, but good contact with a fellow human being who gets it. And I think that's something that probably resonates with some of the comments that were being made by Paul, someone else with lived experience during the session this morning as well. So perhaps now we've got a video. Can we bring in the video that we have from Ella Ray, please?
Hello, my name is Ella Ray and I'm Senior Assistant Psychologist for the National Psychological Professions team at NHS England and Health Education England. As an assistant psychologist and an aspiring psychological professional, the career pathways are incredibly important to me and others in my role. Ultimately, it will influence where in the psychological workforce those in my position end up. So what do the career pathways into the psychological professions look like from my perspective? Well, I want to start by telling you a bit about the pathway into my current role. I finished university armed with a psychology degree, but also with a sense of trepidation. I'd been equipped with a wealth of psychological knowledge, but did not know where to go from here, a feeling I think a lot of graduates feel. Where will I end up, but perhaps even more importantly, what path will I take to get there? It's only through securing my role within the Psychological Professions Network that I've learned of the true diversity of roles that are available for those considering a career in psychology. That is why I feel it's key that this information is readily available to undergraduates and graduates, and why resources such as the career map on the PPN website are so important. However, I think it's worth noting that as an aspiring psychological professional, the career framework can feel quite overwhelming. With such a diverse range of roles to go into and new roles frequently arising, can feel very difficult to navigate. Like many aspiring psychological professionals, my overarching goal is to help people. I want to support those who feel unsure how to support themselves. I want to contribute and lead within the NHS. I want to make a difference. So how do I choose which role to go into? All of the roles have aspects which match my goals. I think this leaves a lot of aspiring professionals slightly bewildered about which role is right for them. This is why I'm passionate about the move towards a coherent career framework for the psychological professions. I feel it is key this framework includes two aspects. Firstly, the framework should incorporate the competencies and traits that are required for each role. Secondly, the framework should state not only the routes in, but the routes upward through each role. What are the opportunities for progression within this role? I feel this will help to ensure the right individuals end up in the role that is most suited to them, and in turn ensure a strong future for the psychology workforce.
Great, thank you very much to Ella for sharing her experience and her thoughts. One thing which she said in there, which I think connected with a lot of comments that people said to me when I was speaking to them, particularly people who had done previous undergraduate courses, either in psychology or in other related disciplines as well. Quite a few people said to me that the information that they'd had access to about psychological professions was quite limited to discussions around clinical psychology, and also a sense that that it was so competitive to get into clinical psychology that there really wasn't any point in trying to get into that. I think this is probably something that we're going to need to find a way of addressing. So I think there might be a question here about whether it might be possible, as Ella said, to develop shared frameworks for competencies, for scopes of practice and career pathways across psychological professions. There might be opportunities right now to address some of these issues. With the expansion of roles and training places, overall workforce needs in the NHS and increased recognition of psychological professions as a coherent group, now might be the right time for us to find these different ways to develop more coherent pathways into, between and within psychological professions. The NHS Career Service, the website of which is on your screen at the moment, through its website, the call centre, and the information that it produces, is a really fantastic resource, accessible for people who are looking to pursue careers within the NHS and within psychological professions, particularly. There's also the fantastic work that Alice Plummer and others have done over the last few years to develop the interactive careers map on the PPN website, which is also on your screens and which Ella mentioned. It's a really useful resource that can help to guide people through not only the different roles, but also the potential career developments from each of those roles. So if you haven't had a chance to play with it, I would really recommend having a look at it as a really useful tool. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So I think it might be possible for us to develop some shared frameworks, and that's what we're going to talk about today, the possibilities of that, and whether it might be possible for us to develop a common basis upon which we can describe what we do to others, that also still values our unique as well as shared professional identities. Today, we've got the opportunity to hear from 3 people looking at improving career pathways from different vantage points. I'm really pleased that we've got Fiona Ballantyne-Dykes from the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy here with us today to talk on behalf of the Scoped project and to describe their hugely impressive work and ambitious work, actually, to develop a shared competency and training framework across counselling and psychotherapy, and to highlight, hopefully, some of the potential learning from that for all of the psychological professions. I'm also really pleased that we have Geeta Bhutani, who's the co-chair of the PPN England and the Northwest, and she's going to present some emerging ideas about potential shared career frameworks for psychological professions, and the work that we might need to do in order to make those things possible. But before we get to that, I'm also really pleased that we have Rob Hardy from the National Workforce Development Centre, who's agreed to set out the broader context and situate psychological professional careers within the wider NHS, with particular reference to projects from his unit looking at the challenges facing the mental health workforce. I hope all of them will forgive me for suggesting that I don't think any of us have all of the answers to these challenges, but we hope that this workshop will be the start of a conversation about how we might collectively address the issues that we're raising. Please do actively engage with the discussion and post things in the Slido. We really do hope that this workshop will begin to influence how we might take some of this work forward. We will try and pick up on as many of the themes as we can in the discussion at the end, and we will also collect and collate all of the feedback anyway. Okay, well, in that case, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Rob Hardy from the National Workforce Development Centre.
Thanks, Phil. Great, well, I'm really pleased to be here, and hi everyone. So I'm Rob Hardy, and I'm the Acting Deputy Director of the National Workforce Skills Development Unit. Bit of a mouthful, tend to just call ourselves the unit. And I've been involved with psychological professions in a variety of guises really since 2008 when I first joined the London IAPT implementation team. I just wanted to quickly, before I go into sort of the main body of my presentation, say a few words about who we are, because I'm sure most of you won't be very familiar with us. Could you just give me the next slide, please? Great, thank you. So we're a small team, and we've been around for about 4 years, and we're hosted by the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust based in North West London. We're commissioned by the National Mental Health Programme at HEE, or Health Education England, to support mental health and learning disabilities workforce and education. I often grandiosely liken what we do to a bit of a think tank, but effectively, while HEE directly commission training placed and implement policy, we support them to do that. We tend to deal with complex workforce challenges, and we certainly don't have all the answers, as Phil mentioned, and we don't position ourselves as experts in any particular area. Rather, we tend to facilitate structure, time and space for experts across the system to think about seemingly intractable problems. Just to give you a really quick flavour of the kinds of things we do. So we're currently writing a children and young people's mental health inpatient workforce strategy. And I guess two of the really sort of key bits in this for us are around retention and career progression, and that's not least for psychological professions working in this area, which I'll touch on a little bit later. We've produced something called a stress and resilience framework, which is an organisational and systemic approach to help organisations support and value staff wellbeing. A key part of this is around the notion of moving away from individual resilience and instead to the organisation's responsibility to look after staff. Mental health nursing education standards kind of are what they say on the tin, really, around the sort of developing some standards to think about competence of adult mental health nurses. And finally, and perhaps most relevant to today, was a mental health careers and attitudes to mental health careers piece of work where we had particular focus on psychology graduates and understanding barriers to career progression and why people do or do not choose a particular mental health career. Next slide, please. Thank you. So today Phil has asked me to spend just a little bit of time thinking about the psychological profession's career pathways and within the wider context of mental health careers. Now I know some of you might not consider yourself a mental health professional and maybe working in other areas, but I've tried to keep this really broad and broad enough hopefully to be applicable to all of you. I want to touch briefly on three things. So what are the wider challenges we face in mental health? There are numbers, of course, but there are other issues. The potential benefits and risks of new and developing psychological roles on the wider system. And I guess given this, I hope to hear some thoughts from you later on about how the psychological professions can best contribute within actually what's quite a challenging context nationally. Next slide, please. Firstly, so challenges. So as I said, a key challenge is around numbers, but it's not just numbers going into the workforce. Of course, we need the right people doing the right things in the right place. And just to briefly demonstrate some of the issues we've got around numbers, I've pulled a graph just released by the Nuffield Trust, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is on the next slide, please. So this is probably going to be a bit difficult to see quite what's going on here, but basically what it's saying is that despite growth of nearly 8,500 extra mental health staff, we still do not meet the target of 11,000. In addition to this, the 2019 Mental Health Implementation Plan outlines ambitions for a further 27,000 on top of this. This is clearly a huge challenge. I think one of the things I thought really interesting, the Nuffield Trust were reporting on, which isn't shown in this graph here, is that actually we've met or even possibly exceeded the planned increase in the psychological professions. This is obviously brilliant news for patients and the NHS and for you guys sat there. But I guess it prompts me to think, I wonder how much the rest of the system can learn from you all and why people's perceptions of psychological professions are comparably perhaps so favourable. Next slide, please. I wanted to pull up this chart from the recent Children and Young Persons Mental Health Benchmarking Report. This is for inpatient units in particular, where of course some of the most vulnerable children and young people are. I think what's really striking about these figures are the huge proportion of support workers, 41%, and this isn't to undervalue them, they're increasingly the primary patient face of the NHS and do amazing work. But contrast that with the low proportion of psychology at 5%. Now, there are many complex reasons for this low proportion, and they're not always negative. But on the face of it, should we not be thinking about supporting the increase in high-skilled therapeutic roles in this setting, perhaps as well as or even instead of those more attractive roles that are sort of, I think, proliferating much more in community settings? Next slide, please. You'll have noticed in my recruitment challenges bullet point, I mentioned the importance of diversity and representation. Now, of course, recruitment is really, really important, but as I'm sure you're aware, there's more going on here. I've purposely chosen a chart taken from our Mental Health Careers project from 2019 that shows mental health nursing by banding. Now, I've done this for a particular reason, and that's because mental health nurses have an overrepresentation at a national level of people who do not report as white, and yet look what happens when you get to band A+. A not dissimilar graph can be shown for gender, where actually you tend to have more men coming in at that band 5 level than you might otherwise expect. But but it's still quite a small proportion. And in fact, the proportion as you go up through the bands increases exponentially. There are similar trends across the whole NHS, not least in the psychological professions, but I think this is one of the starkest given that overrepresentation I just mentioned. And I guess what is going on here, there's clearly some significant barriers in career pathways putting people off. I'm sure the figures on clinical psychology will be familiar to many of you, given all the great work that is going on to address this within clinical psychology and across the psychological professions. And I know these figures will be a little out of date now, but I think the proportion of white applicants who are accepted onto courses is, of course, really stark and still very, very relevant. We're clearly not getting a representative workforce. In some places, it begins at the point of recruitment and is exacerbated through career pathways. And I think that's really important to think about when, I guess, we're going through some of the other thinking we're going to get today. Next slide, please. Retention, culture and wellbeing. So I think retention is a really interesting issue, and I think people often mean different things when they're talking about it. For instance, many service managers are going to be primarily interested in keeping their service largely stable and will see good retention as hanging on to those people they think are good. At the other end of the spectrum, from a national mental health workforce perspective, you might think that there's not that much wrong with a reasonably high turnover as long as people stay within a mental health setting within the NHS. You could possibly argue that a lot of training career pathways within the NHS actually encourage a constant flow of people through different jobs and services. When I was involved in the PWP course at UCL a number of years ago, I would often hear this debate around the issues with high turnover and the use of the role as a stepping stone. I think you can also argue that stepping stones are really valuable, and why would you not provide a platform for highly skilled and motivated people to move on to the next thing? But I accept that feels very different depending on where you're sitting. Wherever you sit on this spectrum though, clearly keeping people in clinical roles is a huge issue within mental health. Put simply, can you justify spending thousands of pounds of public money training someone if they simply leave a year or two later? Outside some of the structural issues that potentially contributed to this career and training ladder, I think one of the biggest contributions to poor retention we currently have is around culture and wellbeing. To put it simply again, being a clinician is really, really challenging psychologically. For me, this means we need to care and look after staff and stop expecting them to be able to just deal with whatever is thrown at them. And this isn't just the right thing to do. Staff who are treated well are going to deliver better care and treatment. They're going to be more motivated and they're going to be far more likely to stay in their jobs. Organisations, in my view, should have an absolute responsibility for valuing the well-being of their staff at least as much as things like finance or productivity. I think the psychological professions can contribute a huge amount here, not least in some of the theoretical models that you use on a daily basis, but also encouraging organisational reflection and showing leadership in how you might do this. Next slide, please. Quickly wanted to say a bit about the new roles in psychological professions, and Phil touched on this in the intro, and I guess from my perspective, sort of knocking around this area for past 15 years or so, seen a huge proliferation over that time, and I've given some examples here on the slides, and I'm sure you've seen and aware of many others. I think it's amazing looking back to 2008 when adult PWPs, or psychological wellbeing practitioners, were brand new, contentious, untested, and then reflecting on the huge contribution they've made to mental health care, and or equally how normal they feel now. Equally amazing is the widespread adoption of other roles such as those that I've mentioned here that at least have some roots, in many cases, based in that adult PWP model. I think this has promoted a psychologization, which is, I think, a word I've made up, but never mind, of mental health care that is perhaps unmatched anywhere in the world. But of course, there are some real issues, be they actual or perceived. Where do all these staff come from, and are they pulling people away from other mental health careers? A really interesting one for me is around the feeling in some professions of the potential to dilute the therapeutic elements of other roles. There can sometimes seem like there's an almost automatic reaction to a patient or service need of creating a new role rather than thinking about those people who are already working in a particular setting and how their roles could be made more attractive. I've often heard mental health nurses in particular talk about how they struggle to define the therapeutic elements of their various roles and how the opportunity to develop and expand clinical skills can be nibbled away by roles that are seen as competing with theirs. I mentioned the made-up psychologization word as a positive above, and it very much is, but there is another side to it, in my view. If more generic roles feel unable to adopt and adapt to incorporating psychological elements into existing roles because there are more specialist and sometimes more attractive jobs specifically doing that, then this can alienate some of the workforce from thinking in a psychologically minded way. How do we keep some of the amazing things I've mentioned over the last few minutes while minimising some of the negatives? How can psychological professions be a bridge to other professions? Next slide, please. And this is my last slide, and really I just wanted to leave you with some very general thoughts about how psychological professions can contribute to the wider context of what I've outlined above. I think there's a huge amount to learn from psychological professions and the work that's being done in diversity, particularly the focus in clinical psychology at the moment. I think the PPNs in particular are really leading the way in some of this, and the way that it's approached and sort of properly thought through and evidence-based. Can we further break down professional barriers and encourage cross-professional learning and support? And how do we do this? How can psychological professions contribute? And finally, leadership. The psychological professions represent some of the most thoughtful, well-trained and often relatively senior clinical people in the NHS. And despite some structural issues, they are in an amazing position to be able to lead in addressing some of the challenges I've highlighted above. Anyway, that's it from me, and I hope that's provoked some thoughts, and really interested to see some any questions that come through, and thanks very much for having me. I'll hand over to Fiona now.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. It seems to follow on very naturally from what Rob's been talking about. I'm Fiona Ballantyne-Dykes, and I'm here representing the Scoped Technical Group, and I'll explain what Scoped is in a moment. In my day job, I'm Deputy Chief Executive at the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy and Chief Professional Standards Officer. But I'm here talking about the Scope project, so let's just see who that is. It's a collaboration of 6 leading professional bodies in counselling and psychotherapy. So between us, we represent really quite a large proportion of the workforce. And you can see there, they're quite large numbers. And the plan was to map the existing published competencies and practice standards for counsellors and psychotherapists across the whole piece, recognising all the kinds of diversity that exist within it, with the aim of creating clear transition points and entry points to the profession. So the output is a shared evidence-based generic competence framework, and I'll come back to that term generic too, because that's important. So as you can see from the logos at the bottom, the people I'm representing are my own organisation, DACP, United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy, UKCP, the British Psychoanalytic Council, this is going to illustrate a point in a minute, BPC, the National Counselling Society, the Association of Christian Counsellors, and the Human Gibbons Institute. And I think that starts to ask why we needed it. But the vision for the project was to have this framework so that counsellors and psychotherapists working with adults, so that those who want to use our services can confidently find the people they need, whatever that service might be, so that clients have a greater understanding of what help is out there and what's more appropriate for them, but also to really shine a light on this skilled and rather underused workforce in the psychological professions, because there are a lot of opportunities that aren't open to them at the moment. We envisaged a clear training progression routes for professionals, valuing the diversity of therapists. And I say that because, you know, many professions have taken the choice to go for a sort of single point of entry, perhaps at degree level, whereas our field is very diverse and there's a lot of people who enter at the vocational level. Now, I want to clarify that doesn't necessarily mean they haven't got degrees in other subjects, but they don't necessarily want to complete another degree at that point. So we've got people coming in with vocational diplomas, and then we've got people, you know, training immediately at level 7 on longer training. So it's a very diverse field. And I think that's a strength because clients have different needs. In terms of why it was needed, well, we know that people looking in at us can find it rather a confusing landscape. And that's interestingly mirroring what was being said about the whole psychological professions workforce. We've got different professional bodies, a huge number, and it can be a bit of an alphabet soup. And they all sound very similar on occasions. We use different titles. Those don't tell us anything very much what somebody actually does. There are all these different modalities, theoretical perspectives, person-centered, psychodynamic, CBT, Gestalt, transaction analysis, humanistic, and the list, I believe there is something like 204, if you list them all. There are different qualifications, as I said earlier, from level 4 right up to, well, doctoral level, in fact. And sometimes we use terms in different ways. So the term accredited, for example, is a very confusing set of meanings. It can mean an individual, it can mean a course, it can mean entry level in one body, and it can mean a higher level in another body. Most importantly as well, for people entering the profession, much as Rob was saying earlier, it's very confusing. That question of how do I train is actually a very complex question. So we want to be fairer to people so they can make more informed choices. The other reason I think it was really needed was to kind of bring transparency so that people can actually see what we do. Counselling and psychotherapy is a lot more than some people realise. And we want to do that so that we are better understood, valued and trusted by key stakeholders, especially the NHS, IAPT in particular, but also the much wider workforce, and many of our members work in private practice. The ultimate aim being access to a choice of high quality psychological therapy. Next slide, please. Just a bit of a word about the structure of SCOPE. I've put it in because I think it actually speaks to why it's worked. So I'll be brief, but it has various layers to it. So at the top layer, you've got the oversight committee, which was, CEOs of the relevant organisations. And that was important because it meant that all the decisions made are actually already agreed at the highest level. And obviously those CEOs have direct lines into their boards and trustees. Then a completely separate expert reference group with an independent chair, Professor Lemmer from UCL in this case, of academics and trainers in all the contexts. And then a technical group, that's who the group I chair, which is practitioners very experienced in training and assessment who literally sat around a table and met every month since 2018. And, that commitment has made a huge difference. Then there's a dedicated secretariat, which has had to be expanded as the work's gone on, including bringing in some dedicated comms support. And the reasons for that will be a bit clear in a minute. So it began with 3 partners deciding it was actually an ethical imperative to try and work together to produce some clarity on various subjects, but the actual SCOPE project started in 2018. But a key moment for us was when the partnership was widened last year to include the new partners, and they're listed there, ACC, NCS and Human Givens. And that was important both politically and practically. Politically because we were open to accusations of not being inclusive, but practically because they've brought another whole set of challenges and perspectives to the framework, which has enriched it in many ways. At that point, we also appointed an independent chair to the Oversight Committee to ensure that all voices had equal resonance. And we also took that opportunity to recruit experts by experience to the project, which was always in our thinking, but perhaps we weren't so clear about how to go about it in the early days and what was the right point. And another significant moment for us was that the PSA, the Professional Standards Authority, who we all hold accredited registers with, asked to be an observer of the project. And again, that felt like a landmark moment because they're interested to see how shared standards frameworks can actually support the agenda around public protection, because we're in an unregulated world, and although they look at organisational standards, they're less focused on profession-specific standards. So they're very supportive of this work. Next slide, please. So what we did is we got round a table, meeting monthly, and we gathered together all the evidence we could find around practice standards, training standards, competencies, from as many published sources as we could find. And that included things like European standards, the published frameworks, national occupational standards, professional body standards, membership requirements, accreditation standards, etc., etc. And then some specialist frameworks as well, for example, around suicide or workplace. And we tried to sort them into what trainings they were attached to, where those trainings were taking place, what was the content, and we then were able to map those into 3 columns. And there's kind of 2 parts to this. This slide shows the practice standards, which is principally about the sort of length and level of training and associated practice requirements. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the actual competencies in the next slide. So you can see what the mapping showed, and don't forget this was a mapping, it wasn't creating something new, is that people enter the profession at 3 different points. As I mentioned, there's the level 4 diploma level, typically a 2-year course, and then you've got a middle section, which sits somewhere between the 2, and then the third, the C level, you've got people doing a minimum of 4 years training in one go. But what is innovative about this is that it actually establishes a relationship between those different entry points. And by defining the competencies and the practice standards, it offers the opportunity for clear progression. Now, that was something that didn't happen typically in the past. In fact, it was not uncommon to be told, even after thousands of hours of experience, if you wanted to join, say, a psychotherapy training, that you had to go back to the beginning. Well, that's obviously doesn't make sense for someone who wants to expand their practice. So what's, again, interesting about this is there was a common agreement. You know, there's a lot, it was easy, not easy, but it was quite possible to reach this map, because actually when you looked at the standards, there were areas of commonality. For example, you know, an entry-level training requires 100 hours supervised client work in an approved placement. Everyone agreed on that. And so forth across the piece. So I'm not going to go into the detail because you'll miss the key messages. One thing to say, though, that these trainings weren't completely associated with the titles people were using. And for that reason, we opted for ABC. And that was kind of to take some of the heat out of the kind of attachment that people have to their professional identity. And I think, again, that's a really important point for the issues that the whole workforce is facing, that there are huge attachments to professional identity, but they don't necessarily speak to what a person is able to do. So next slide, please. So this gives you just a snapshot of the way the competence were organised. So we basically grouped them into 5 themes, which kind of reflect the process of therapy and looks familiar to a practicing counsellor or psychotherapist. And then the competencies sit in 3 columns. You can see A, B, C, which relate to the diagram just before. The methodology for all this is published on the website, and it's quite rigorous. So you can interrogate the data and the way in which we reach decisions. The important point to pick out here, though, is that the standards and competencies were expressed in a generic language. Now, again, because of the many different traditions, that was quite a challenge. But what it did do is it enabled us to reach across lots of different traditions around training. We haven't probably got all the language right yet, but we've certainly worked very hard to find a language that's as inclusive as possible. One more point about the progression is that the greatest diversity is at the first entry point. So there are issues around equality and diversity that we need to take account of when trying to establish this as a model that we can all sign up to as some kind of a benchmark. Next slide, please. So I wanted to put in a word about limitations. There are 1 or 2 PSA registered holders that aren't part of this. And there are obviously professional bodies that aren't in the PSA scheme at all, and those weren't included. It's not perfect. There's some areas of difference. We haven't solved the question of title yet, although we are still very ambitious to do that. And it's on the phase 2 part of the project, which is coming up. But we have agreed, you know, broadly what the groups are, what the competencies are, what the practice standards are. And this is amongst 6 bodies who didn't traditionally even talk to each other in many contexts. I wouldn't say that all of them, but there were some very big barriers and long-standing rivalries. And I think that was one of the things that makes this quite different. It doesn't include specialisms, which of course might fit somebody to a role in addition to their core training, because this is focused on core training. And of course, there are some folk who just don't see competence frameworks as being able to express what we do in counselling and psychotherapy. So that's kind of something we manage. Next slide, please. So the key outcomes, I hope, will be clear that we have established competence and practice standards associated with different entry points. A word about the gateways. So one of the things we will agree is transparent gateways from one column to another. And there are some existing mechanisms to already transition, but one of the potentials of the framework is we can have more innovative ones which take account of greater diversity and greater ways of evidencing your progression without necessarily undertaking expensive additional training. We hope the information is accessible to stakeholders, particularly the NHS, and PPN networks, commissioners, but also, of course, the public. So I'll move on from that. One sort of byproduct is it also establishes a very basic minimum standard for everybody, which wasn't articulated anywhere before. And again, in an unregulated environment, that's actually very important. The soft outcomes were, as I've mentioned, greater trust between professional groups. And the actual act of mapping the evidence did bust some myths, you can say it that way around, but led to greater transparency and a greater respect for the different routes into the profession and the different ways of working. And that's had a notable impact on external stakeholders who are sort of looking at this and saying, actually, they're working together. That's great. And we can see what they're doing. That's great. And actually, we don't need to talk to 7 bodies or 6 bodies or 10 bodies. We can talk to one body and they can represent. And that's certainly happening in other areas, particularly in our work with the NHS. Next slide, please. So I've tried to capture some of the factors contributing to success, and I'm also aware that I haven't got eons of time, so I'll be fairly brief. But I think strong leadership and vision, which again is a theme that's come up before, is critical. The willingness to commit resources, a dedicated secretariat, and you know that was absolutely, it just wouldn't have happened without people chasing people, because everybody who's contributing has another job. So they're not able to completely concentrate on one project. That practitioners willing to contribute huge amounts of time, particularly to the technical group, which has just met so relentlessly, and the building of strong relationships. Thank you. Next slide. I think willingness to be flexible. We've made a number of changes to the governance. We've made changes to the ERG. The decision to include new partners, which meant revisiting a lot of the evidence and considering new evidence. That's paid dividends. Listening to feedback, and I mean evidence-based feedback, not just opinions, you know, where we felt somebody has offered evidence we've missed something, where there was accusations that it was too focused on what's perceived as a medical model, which of course wasn't the intention at all, but all those kinds of things act as a barrier. The independent chairing, and the other 2 points I've more or less covered elsewhere, dedicated comms officer in due course and strong working relationships. Thank you. Next slide. I wanted a separate slide to talk about the experts by experience because that has been transformative. And we were helped in looking at how to go about this from Laura Lee, actually, who's represented on the NHS doing similar work, who was very helpful just in helping us think about what we needed to do. So we've been joined by 4 experts by experience, and it's made such a big difference to the work. And I think we thought they might just come along to some meetings, but actually their willingness to contribute means they come to all the meetings now, not necessarily all of them all of the time, but they have really been generous and committed and challenged us on some important points. Why are we doing this work? It's actually for our clients. It's not for the profession. It's not self-serving. Asking us to ditch the jargon. I think reminding us that the qualities of a therapist, and this was a point that was mentioned earlier, is just as important as their ability to perform certain functions. So that you'll see in the next iteration of the framework, some of that has come into the language. To absolutely foreground the importance of equality, diversity, and inclusion in every aspect. So the readability of documents, the content of documents, and so on. And sometimes they just helped us find practical solutions. So I want to give them a special thanks because it's also helped us to behave better. because we want to do this for the right reasons. Thank you. Next slide. Challenges, just again, they're kind of self-evident in a way, but a lot of very vocal but minority negativity, especially on social media, and accusations of doing it for wrong reasons, self-serving reasons, making money, closing down the profession, homogenization, that kind of thing. Overcoming long-standing rivalries, that was a big challenge, especially bringing new partners in. And being prepared to delay for the wider benefit of widening the project. But I think above all, staying with difficulties as they arose and being prepared to work through them, which is only possible once you've built a strong element of trust. And there's another slide on challenges, which I'll whiz through. Yes, I mean, the amount of feedback from 75,000 people is difficult to put into a meaningful shape. Sometimes not all organisations can contribute equally because we have a very different size and have different resources. The actual attacks and misinformation in member forums has been quite personally challenging and exhausting. And of course, every time somebody leaves because people move on, then you've got to rebuild that relationship with the new person. So I would say those were the main challenges. Next slide, please. So what next? We've published 2 iterations so far. This is the next one, which has got the new partner input. The EB input is due out in January 22. I hope you'll see some very significant improvements. Phase 2 includes an impact assessment, a formal impact assessment, and each individual partner will take a decision about actually implementing or adopting the framework themselves. I think that's looking very positive. And then there will have to be an ongoing commitment to the framework to ensure that it stays relevant and up to date. And it could include new areas of work, for example, children and young people. We think if we were in a position to be under the cosh for more regulation, we'd be in a better position than we've been because of this shared work. And hopefully we are also bringing credibility and client choice to the psychological professions workforce. Thank you very much. Handing over to Geeta.
Thanks, Fiona. So it's over to me to not answer probably all the questions that you have about this, but I think perhaps just highlight some of the, I suppose, the issues that both Rob and Fiona have really helped us think about, and perhaps add a few more questions into it in terms of thinking about how this could change and what do we need to actually do to change it. So context, this is pretty familiar probably to all of you. All the feedback that we see around psychological interventions or around people wanting talking therapies in the NHS, that is a driver. So that's been recognised in the NHS long-term plan that there's a need for expansion in the psychological professions. There has been an increase in funding for training for clinical psychology, child and adolescent psychotherapy, paid experience opportunities, as well as sort of training for staff in things like family therapy training or CBT for psychosis, and many more, which I can't go into. And I think the other thing that we've also noticed probably over the last, well, longer than 18 months now, I guess, is the implications of COVID and perhaps the demands around improving staff health and well-being within the NHS and the public sector more generally. So, but why is the lack of an integrated career framework a problem? If you're trying to access services, there are challenges around access and choice. I mean, I think we're probably all aware that waiting times can be very challenging and they can be very lengthy. Also, we don't always offer a choice of therapy or therapist in many of our services. And I'm not going to single out any particular one because I expect many of you are aware of that. I think we've certainly heard already from our speakers today that staff turnover and career progression is not managed that well. And there's vacancies and difficulties in recruiting across the board. I think the other thing that's worth highlighting, and I know we talked about it a bit more on Monday, was that workforce development and planning is still fragmented, though we are trying to work at it from the sort of psychological professions point of view. And there's quite a challenge in terms of meeting the ambitions of the long-term plan. Oops, here we go. So don't look at this too closely. because it's not accurate, but it represented my attempt about 6 to 8 months ago of, well, what are the career routes? How do you actually make any kind of progress? And you can see that a lot of these arrows don't go all the way up. It's also quite reductionist in the sense it's very much focused on a large NHS provider organisation in terms of how jobs operate. And I think we're very much aware that people have roles in all sorts of sectors, including independent sector work, voluntary sector work, as well as sort of higher education institutions and the like. So from that point of view, it's a crude attempt just to demonstrate that if you get on a particular track, it can be difficult to actually think about how you might develop a career framework or competencies or skills, or even transition from working with adults to adults with psychosis, for example. So not accurate, but hopefully it'll give you some idea that there are barriers to progression. And I think that it kind of represents there's a lack of synergy between many of our roles. So none of the roles actually enable transition into another role, supported by additional training experience. And I think the recognition of previous acquired experience has been very limited to date. I think Fiona's presentation of the SCOPED work, I think, represents a massive step forward in terms of what's happening in the counselling and psychotherapy world. And I think also, certainly for some of the psychological professions, it's a very graduate-focused entry. And it could be said it's also a very psychology graduate-focused entry. And we do have challenges around widening participation in terms of addressing, I think, greater diversity issues across the board. And we heard more about that this morning, that, there are challenges for people to be able to access experience, have choice of careers and that kind of thing. So in conclusion, it's fragmented. There's no clear progression in terms of careers for most psychological professions. I think there's an assumption that within clinical psychology there is clear progression, and there may be, but that's not a pathway. There's a series of stepping stones, and perhaps some clinical psychologists would say, well, I know I want to do this, but I don't really know how to get there. I would say it's probably harder for many of the other psychological professions where there isn't a clear career route or a pay structure. There's also still inconsistency in funded training routes. So currently some training is fully funded, both salaries and also training costs. In others, it isn't. And we've mentioned limited career development opportunities. And I think the other thing that's worth just highlighting is that there are significant inconsistencies in accreditation and regulation, with, I think, about 2/3 of the psychological professions of the 12 currently accredited by professional bodies, and 1/3 who are actually subject to statutory regulation. So again, not helpful, and perhaps not helpful for anyone trying to make sense of this either internally or externally. So what would an integrated approach look like, or what could it look like? I think one of the things we'd like to look at more consistently is what would an entry point look like from undergraduate or graduate. Don't want to close off either route. I think the other thing is, I think we've seen in terms of some of the comments so far this week, is that choosing a training route doesn't mean you close off future opportunities. There should be opportunities to transition. There should be something about, well, I decided to work with adults, but I'd really like to work with children, as my life's changed, for example. But we don't really make that possible. But I think it's also important that with publicly funded courses, we need to have some consolidation of training so that people don't jump from one course to another. There needs to be something where people do provide services to those who want them. And I think something around, there are challenges to the supply of the workforce, and perhaps we could think about how those could be funded. So what else could we think about? I think something about recognition of entry-level qualification for further training. This is an example. I'm not picking on PWPs or systemic and family therapy training deliberately. There are plenty of other examples that would fall into this category. It just happened to be the one that came to mind. That if you're a PWP, it's not easy to get into family therapy training, just purely as a PWP. I think the consideration of the accreditation of prior experiential learning is important, and I know that's something that's highlighted by Fiona's presentation. And I think there's also something about how do we actually support development when people get their core qualification to come into the workforce. And I think the other thing is, for some psychological professions, it's easier than others to retain some clinical contact as senior roles progress and they don't become purely managerial. I mean, that, to be fair, is a problem that's shared with other professional groups, that, for example, very few nurses are able to retain clinical work when they move into more senior or managerial roles. So I just wanted to provide you with a very brief example, which I'm probably not going to have enough time to do, explain all the ins and outs, which is, you'll be able to look that up on the website in terms of what is advanced clinical practice. So the definition is there, but the purpose of advanced clinical practice was to try and help people make sense of the extended roles that were being undertaken. Initially, it was scoped out with nurses and allied health professionals, and particularly in acute physical health. So there would perhaps be nurses delivering a range of different types of things which were not typical of an average nurse role at that level. So how could that actually be clarified and recognised as being an advanced clinical practice model? And what was defined was something around 4 pillars: clinical practice, leadership and management, education and research, as well as clinical competence. The difficulty is there's been a whole load of work been going on in this over the last 4 years, but at the moment it's only open to the psychological professions who are subject to statutory regulation, i.e. the practitioner psychologists. And that excludes our cognitive behaviour therapy colleagues, our counsellors, our psychological wellbeing practitioners, and so on. It's something we've been working on quite hard within the National Workforce Group, and there is recognition that these groups do need to be included. It's also important to remember it's not just the psychological professions. The healthcare scientists also have professions within their family that are affected by this. So what we're currently doing in terms of trying to address it is actually looking at a pilot project, which is taking a portfolio approach for, I think, about 4 psychological professions who are actually working their way through some of these equivalent 4 pillars to see how they can use a portfolio approach to demonstrate that they meet an advanced clinical practice framework requirements. And I really, really hope that that pilot, which is due to finish next year, will provide an opportunity to completely include all the psychological professions in the opportunities that this could bring. Because I think as a framework which covers a range of professions, I think it could provide an opportunity to provide that career progression, provide career advancement in a way that's perhaps easier for our colleagues in management or outside the professions to actually understand. I've mentioned a lot about accreditation and registration, and I think it's really important. I mean, one of the ways that we protect the public is by having a scheme which sets standards, sets expectations, and I think in terms of having psychological professions in the regulatory framework, I think it would be very, very useful. There is something about simplifying registration, and I think there's also something about how do we, I suppose, come up with a framework or a taxonomy to make sense of what that registration needs to look like. And that's probably another complicated piece of work to add to the achievements that I think Fiona and colleagues have already made within the counselling and psychotherapy field. So this was another attempt, perhaps more recent, to think about a future model. Again, very much focused on NHS provider world, and it doesn't take into account the range of other roles that people can take on with other bodies, and it doesn't take into account, you know, things like teaching, training, or committee-based roles or professional roles that outside organisations. But wouldn't it be good if there was, the entry points could include a widening access route, perhaps through an assistant practitioner route. It could include the undergraduate route, and it could include apprenticeships as well, across the board, which it currently doesn't. You know, those different routes apply to different professional entry points. And then we could have routes around practitioner training, and perhaps newly qualified, more senior practitioners, lead practitioners, but also something which enables people to develop. I think while clinical psychologists often end up in the leadership positions in NHS provider organisations, partly, I'm a clinical psychologist, we've probably been around within the NHS a lot longer than many of the other groups, but that isn't a reason that I suppose, monopoly necessarily needs to continue. I don't think it's fair to say that one professional group within the psychological professions family is pre-qualified to lead the profession. I think leadership cuts across all professional groups. And I think, you know, some of the challenges we have as a psychological professions family within provider organisations is that our leadership at board level is not fulfilled by a psychological professional. It's often through nursing. So, and they can be very good leaders, and inevitably in all professional groups, some may not be quite so good leaders. But I think it's really important that we have those opportunities there for all of us. So I think this is pretty much my final slide. And I think what we'd be really interested to hear from you is, are these the right suggestions in terms of areas that we need to look at? And what do you think are the initial priorities? And probably a pretty simple question. Does the diagram help, even though I do know it's not quite accurate? And probably like most diagrams, it'll be inaccurate as soon as it's been done. So thank you very much. And I'd like to now hand back to Phil.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. It's really, really helpful to for all the presentations. Actually, really, really useful. I think it's great to hear some of the kind of the bigger picture, and I think some of the comments that you had to make, Rob, around the overall workforce stuff. I think really chimes with some of the other sessions that we've had and situates psychological professions within the broader picture. I think also, Geeta, I think a lot of your work raises a whole range of other questions, some of which comes out in the Slido comments as well, which we'll come to in a second. And Fiona, I think that there's actually within the Slido quite a lot of love for the Scoped project, as far as I can see. Actually, some really nice comments actually about how impressive a piece of work it is, and how good it is to see different groups coming together and working collectively on something. There was one question that came up, was about what happens if the groups don't agree. What will then happen to the Scoped project? Is that something we could answer?
I think it's a very fair question. So the project's been split into two phases. The publication of the framework, which is due, as I said, in January 2022. And everyone's agreed on that. We're planning the comms, we're dotting the I's, crossing the T's, everyone's signed up to that. The second step, which includes, as I said, the impact assessment, it depends what relationship the different bodies have with their decision-making processes. So for some people, it's a board decision, for some people, they've committed to a member vote. So we at the moment, we have to respect that people have different ways of getting that buy-in to total impact, but I am confident that the Scope project will still have enough people involved to go ahead, and if any one body decides it can't be part of it, then they will presumably leave, but I'm very hopeful that won't be the case.
Thank you, Fiona, that's really helpful. As we're going along, what I'd quite like to do, we've got some questions that we'd like to bring into the Slido as well, so we can get some feedback from people around some specific issues. Matt, I'm wondering if we could enter the first question into the Slido now. I think some of the specific things that you brought up, Geeta. So I think maybe the first question that we're wanting to ask is, do you think that there needs to be better marketing of information about potential careers in psychological professions? Now, if everybody that's watching is able to enter their response to that into Slido, then we'll come back to that in a second and see what people are thinking. There's some early results already coming in. I can see. But while that's going on, some other questions that have been asked in Slido, I wonder whether we might pick up as a panel. There were quite a lot of questions about the specific entry routes in, and I think particularly about the issue of getting into psychological professions if you don't have a psychology degree. Geeta, I wondered whether you might pick that up directly.
Okay, thanks, Phil. So that is true, and it is pretty there's quite a lot of variation. So, for example, I think for the psychological wellbeing practitioner role in particular, and I think the new mental health wellbeing practitioner role, you don't actually need a psychology degree to be able to enter the training for those professions or those roles. You do need to be able to demonstrate an ability to study at least an undergraduate level. If you do have a degree, you can enter it, at postgraduate level. That isn't true for the pilot associate psychological practitioner role or the clinical associate in psychology role, and neither is it true to enter the doctorate in clinical psychology, I think, or forensic psychology or health psychology or counselling psychology. And part of the training for the practitioner psychologist roles, it expects an undergraduate degree in psychology, which is recognised by the British Psychological Society. There are conversion routes, but clearly that's going to add to people's time to actually reach that qualification. I think all those questions are probably ones we need to talk about, and there will be good reasons for some of those to stay in place, but there may be other things we can look at in terms of actually making this a little bit more coherent.
Thank you, Geeta. That's really helpful. Matt, are we able to show the outcome so far from that poll in Slido? So it's looking like that question about the better marketing of potential information. It's fairly strong yes coming through there, although there's about 2% of people are saying definitely no. So there's obviously some doubts about it, but a fairly strong yes. Are we able to go back to the Slido questions, Matt? Thank you. I think maybe if we can close that poll now and go back to the Slido questions. So maybe just taking another one of the general questions. I think a really good question that came in from Paul Lawson is, how do you inspire people to remain long-term in whatever role that they decide? Rob, I wonder whether you might have some thoughts about that.
Sure. I mean, I guess my first response to that, I think, would be to answer it with a question, I suppose, is it appropriate or desirable to do that? So I think there's a real sort of interesting tension, as I tried to get to in my presentation, of why are people so desperately trying to hang on to people in the same role, as the same band, when many people, and I think this is really particularly true of the psychological professions given the entry qualifications that are often required, I think it's not unreasonable to expect that many of them will want to move on. Having said that, I think there are a number of things to do. I think it's clear that the relationship with a line manager is crucial, absolutely crucial in this. And I think the ability of that line manager to be able to reflect and think with that person in a really open and honest way and sort of demonstrate trust and sort of genuine engagement, I think is possibly the most critical part of it. I think there's something about the organisation, again, as I touched on in my slides, around the organisation actually valuing and almost protecting the individual from some of the stuff that goes on around, that I think is a natural part of being anywhere in the NHS, but I think particularly if you're a clinician. I guess, I mean, I think one of the really big barriers, which I think unfortunately we can't necessarily do much about in the NHS, is around the way Agenda for Change is structured. I mean, it is set to reward effectively progression through different pay bands, which is often linked to different levels of training. And I think it's important to sort of recognise that that's a bit built in really into many of the things that we do. And I think really the only way to counterbalance that is that relationship with your line manager, is that relationship with the rest of your team, is by sort of providing that genuine engagement and support, whilst at the same time recognising that much of the time that genuine engagement and support will result necessarily in that person and you identifying with that person, that then they may be ready to move on elsewhere. I'm not sure that quite answers what you're getting at, but I don't really think there is quite an answer.
I guess I'd just add slightly that I think there might be an issue that for a lot of services, turnover of staff can be seen as a problem for the overall service. Whereas obviously, I think in my view that's quite a short-term way of looking at the issue here, and how we retain talent across an entire career might be a very, very different conversation to the immediate needs of operational services at an immediate time. So I think that's where quite a lot of the tension appears, I think, in my experience. I wonder, Matt, whether it might be possible to bring up another one of the questions for the poll in the Slido. So the next question was about whether there ought to be development of more non-graduate routes into psychological professions. Looks like we've already had quite a lot of responses for that already. Are we able to bring that onto the screen, Matt? So again, this looks largely positive, doesn't it? That people are thinking that it would be good to have the development of more non-graduate routes into psychological professions. Obviously, we'll see how this develops with more feedback as well. And can we come back to the Slido? Thank you. So another question that was coming up within the Slido was about.
I think we can't hear Phil.
Phil's gone.
Right. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. Okay, sorry about that. One of the questions that's coming up regularly in the Slido is also about several people saying that they don't really understand what the issue is about finding it difficult to recruit, given that there are so many people that are wanting to get into psychological professions. I think part of this is the response to this is about bottlenecks and difficulties of progression into and through careers. But I wondered whether we might say a bit about what we all thought as a panel around what could potentially be done about that. Rob, you're nodding your head again.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting one, because I think you do hear a lot about the difficulties of recruitment into psychological professions, and yet you also sort of almost hear about the oversubscription and of people wanting to go into these roles and how competitive they are. And I guess there's something for me about thinking about the needs of the user, and by user I mean the person trying to get into that career, versus the needs of a particular service or a profession. I think probably for me, there's something about why is it that so many people are so desperate to get into the psychological professions, much less interested perhaps in going into, say, mental health nursing, just to pick one, when actually there's really quite a clear career pathway that you can move sort of from band 5 all the way up to band 9 in a very sort of clear, constructive way. Now, I know there are loads and loads of reasons around perception, and I'm sure, and sort of how people might think about that, and not least funding. I mean, a lot of the psychological professions course, at least for clinical psychology and the low intensity PWP roles, are effectively funded nationally, whereas you have to take out a loan to do things like mental health nursing. So that's a clear barrier. For me, I think there's something about getting to the sort of nub of what are people wanting out of these kinds of roles, and thinking more broadly than just the psychological professions. It's not just the psychological professions that can provide therapeutic roles. I think there are other roles, and the interaction between these roles is, I think, where some of the amazing stuff really happens, rather than thinking in a sort of straitjacketed psychological professions way, which I'm sure is slightly anathema in many ways, given that I'm at a PPN conference. But I think it's important to really think outside just of psychology.
Thanks, Rob. Fiona, Gita, was there anything you'd add to that?
I was going to make a comment slightly connected to the previous point, which is around burnout and overwhelm. And it's interesting that the competence framework we've developed includes, self-care and includes, understanding effects of traumatization, vicarious trauma, working with people who are very distressed. So I think there are other reasons why people move in and out of jobs, particularly in the NHS, which is incredibly pressured. So I wanted to pick up that point particularly. And also just a quick point on vocational training, entry points. Most counsellors and psychotherapists fund their own training. It's not, apart from this wonderful new pilot we've just got off the ground for counsellors and psychotherapists to enter the NHS. And one of the reasons for that, the vocational route, is that it's a lot less expensive and it's rooted in communities. So I think that is a model that we should pass on as something really rich. As I said earlier, it doesn't necessarily mean people haven't got degrees in other subjects, but to embark on another full career loan to do when you don't need all that is not necessarily the most efficient way. And the proliferation of roles, again, there's a lot of core skills here, and the research is very clear that core skills around relational ability are a good foundation for many of these roles. And that's something that I think we could build on rather than, again, starting again from scratch, trying to address particular needs within a particular context.
I was wondering whether, do we think that there might be some work to be done around mapping those competencies and those core competencies you're saying across different professional groups that might aid transition and development between different roles and across roles? Is that something you'd think, Geeta, in terms of the work that you've been doing, that might be a benefit of having a shared map?
I think there could be. I just wanted to pick up the previous point in terms of the entry routes. I think there's just a couple of things to add before I get to that. The first is that unlike nursing or physiotherapy or occupational therapy or other qualifications like that, the psychology degree isn't an entry point into the NHS as it stands on its own. So consequently, the only way in is to do further training in something or some psychological work. And perhaps that's something we might want to think about. It's not saying that every psychology degree or every iteration of a psychology degree should lead you to the NHS, because there are many other career paths from a psychology degree which people want and people should continue with, and it's about an additionality there. So I think that's one thing to think about. I think the other thing is probably historical reasons and cultural reasons within the NHS. There are unintended and perverse consequences of cost improvement programs, which do mean that roles which do not attract high redundancy costs or are filled with people on temporary contracts will be the first to go if you have to make savings. And that's nothing about the individual involved in those roles, because they do really good jobs. It's just the pragmatics of how do you manage a service. And I think we've had years of trying to sort of navigate that, which means probably over the last 20 years there's been a massive reduction in assistant psychology type roles. Picking up on the competency framework and the shared competency framework, I think it's a fantastic idea. I think looking at Fiona's description of how she's managed to get 75,000 people to kind of cooperate in this, I think there's an awful lot we could learn from the counselling and psychotherapy, but in terms of extending it across. I think, though, it probably is about engagement and, do the other psychological professional body groups see this as a way forward to create coherence. And I think one of the things that's really important is having that shared understanding that this is not about a lowest common denominator, which, I'm not saying Fiona's work was, because it clearly was the opposite, but about how do we actually make sense of our world. And I think the thing that I suppose when we started, Phil, and apologies for just going on this one, but when Ella sort of said the framework should incorporate the competences of each role and outline not only the routes in, but the routes upward as well, I kind of thought, well, actually, I didn't need to say anymore. I thought that kind of summarised it beautifully. So thank you.
Fantastic.
Can I add a quick thing, Phil?
Of course, yes.
That also level doesn't tell the story. A competence-based approach it offers greater transparency, as I said, for what people are able to do, and we can get very hung up in progression around around it being an academic progression. And I'm not anti-academic, I've got a strong academic background myself, but I just think that can kind of get us stuck into various dead ends that don't actually need to exist.
It's really helpful, thank you. Matt, I'm just wondering whether we might be able to jump to the last Slido question that we that we had. One of the questions that we had was about whether we think a shared framework and language for career development would be helpful. And we've that there's quite a strong support for that actually as a definite yes, which is good. Matt, do we have the open Slido question as well? Do we have that final one, or is that not there? Just that one. Okay, that's great. Thank you. So maybe we could come back to the Slido questions, and we'll see if we can pick up another couple of those. A number of the questions actually probably touching on a very similar point to the one that we were just making about how we might help progression across the different professions. For example, somebody's asking about progression from support worker to education mental health practitioner, or peer support worker to PWP. So making use of kind of prior experience in other places, and how we might, whether there might be ways that we could improve the recognition of those kinds of prior competencies for gaining entry into our pathways. That was probably more of a comment than anything else, but is there anything more that people wanted to pick up on in relation to that?
I think there's one thing, Phil, I'd add, which is that the way the psychological wellbeing practitioner role was set up, and the way the mental health wellbeing practitioner has been set up, is the intention is there should be a support worker or an assistant practitioner route into it. I think, though, the challenge has been that those roles have been very much applied for by psychology graduates trying to seek entry to the workforce. So we've got a lot of people out there wanting to come in. And I think we probably need to think about how we maximise the diversity opportunities for people.
That's great, thank you. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so is there any final thoughts that people had, or other things that it might be useful for us to offer before we move to our closing slides? I suppose one extra thing we probably haven't covered that did come up in the Slido in the questions was there was a question about whether there is any data available about the current and predicted future workforce numbers across all of psychological professions. And certainly I know that there is some data available. Geeta, I don't know if you have those numbers to hand.
I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, but if you look on the PPN England website, in terms of, there are 2 documents on there in terms of how the psychological professions can contribute to meeting the challenges of the NHS long-term plan, and those figures are in there. Plus a lot more, I think, information that might help people understand the context around them.
Fiona, did you want to add something to that?
Well, I was going to make a more general point that it's very encouraging that we're having these conversations. I mean, you know, this does seem like a fresh moment to say we've got to do something about this, and I just would like to be part of that.
Yeah, so I mean, a final comment I'd make is that in going and speaking to a lot of different people in different places around this in preparation for this, I did think that I increasingly felt the sense of just how such an important issue this really is, at a time where we are expanding quite rapidly, and a lot of people are coming into psychological professions and are really looking to find ways of being able to develop careers in different ways and wanting to have sustainable careers in the future. It does really feel to me like a time that we could come together and really find some ways of supporting both our shared but also our unique competencies across different professional groups. So it does feel like a really positive time to me as well. Okay, we are getting close to time now, so I think, Matt, we've got a final slide for the closing thing. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. Please do, there'll be three further questions in the Slido, which are the evaluation questions for this session. Please do give feedback. We will be collecting that, and it's really, really helpful for us in designing things going forward. Please, before you leave as well, once you've submitted your feedback, you'll be able to download your certificate of attendance. Please do that before you leave the session. Thank you very much for joining us today. We have further sessions tomorrow, and I hope as many of you as possible will be able to join us for those. So my thanks finally again to all three of our speakers today, and thank you very much to everybody for joining us.